My name is Diana Tate Vermeer. I'm the SVP of Strategy at Schott Foundation for Public Education. My pronouns are she, her, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. So thank you so much for joining a discussion on Endow Now, a game-changing strategy for investing in racial justice. We're so happy for you to be with us today. A few housekeeping items just really quickly. I wanted to share with you that Schott Foundation is recording this session, so we are mic'd and going to keep some video recording of this session, but if you are not in the screen or in the shot, but just wanted to make sure that you are aware of that as we move forward. I'm also going to take a moment to introduce each of our panelists who are going to be in discussion with us here today, and given this the group and the size, we really hope that this is a discussion, an engagement with each of you about what is the opportunity, what we all see as the chances, and what we can do to truly invest in transformational change in our communities. As I introduce our folks, I always like to hear a little bit from panelists about why they do the work they do. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time and ask them to do that, set the stage a little bit, give some context to our discussion, and then we'll jump right in. And we hope that you are engaged participants in that. So start thinking of your questions and what you want to hear and put to the group because we welcome that. So thank you again for being here. Again, Diana Vermeer at the Schott Foundation. Here to my right is Dr. John Jackson, the president and CEO of Schott Foundation for Public Education. John, why is it that you do the work that you do?
I do it, I've been doing it because I'm in a position to do it because someone did it before me. And I just think that we have that obligation, and I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I see the hundreds and thousands of other young people who are still there. If they have the opportunity, we can do so much more.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. To John's right is Zakia Ansari. She's the Advocacy Director at Alliance for Quality Education, AQE, and she is also a Schott board member, someone who is near and dear to our heart. Why do you do the work that you do?
I think initially it started because I have 8 children, and so I actually knew they would all be all right educationally, but as I started to understand what organizing was, I realized back then I was planning for doing this work so my grandchildren didn't have to struggle and their children didn't have to struggle, and so now I have grandchildren in schools and we still haven't figured this liberation, freedom thing out yet, so I'm just in it for the long haul.
Thank you. And to her right is Lee Parker with JP Morgan Private Bank, a banker and executive director who's committed to these issues. Why do you do the work you do?
So I was thinking about that question, and when I was having a conversation with Diallo, it reminded me that when I was growing up, my parents had a business. They owned a hardware store. And this was before the Home Depots and the Lowe's came on the scene. Well, when they did come on the scene, my parents had to shut their business down because they didn't have the resources to pivot. And it was, when I reflect back on that moment, that was the pivotal moment where I said, I want to make sure that individuals and families of color have the resources they need to achieve whatever they wish to achieve. And I broadened that to individuals and then also institutions. So whatever your goals are, social or otherwise, my role is to make sure that I help you get access to the resources you need in order to achieve that. So that's why I do what I do.
Wonderful. And last but not least, we have with us Derek Johnson, president and CEO of the NAACP. What brought you to your work?
So thinking about childhood, I think we all have those tipping points that kind of inform what we end up doing, whether we realize it was that tipping point. I grew up in Detroit, rough neighborhood, but a beautiful neighborhood. We could talk about it pre-crack, post-crack. Our house was one of those houses that was seen as a safe haven, first because of my great aunt, and then later my mother. And so helping people was a part of what the family did. Secondly, we used to love to hear that Coleman Young, who was the mayor, was going to be on television because we knew he was going to cuss every time he was on TV. And for someone that was in elementary, middle school, and high school, his cussing later evolved for me that he was fighting for the city that he was protecting. And then thirdly, I can recall the first time I seen Eyes on the Prize on PBS. This is pre-cable. We had 5 stations: ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS, and CBC, because it was right across the street from Windsor. And I remember, and I can't remember how old I was, that I was standing on a couch punching the air when I seen the dogs being placed on the children. And so now that in this role, it's about helping people, it's about protecting community, it is about making sure we can really aspire to a higher opportunity compared to where many of us have come from and what structural barriers have been put in front of us.
Thank you for that. So we have in front of us a team of experts, folks committed to racial justice in their life and their commitment to their work, focused on education justice. I think we all know that public education is under attack. It has long been under attack. As we have opened the schoolhouse doors to more and more and different children, so has the attacks on public education increased and intensified, whether it be in the policing of schools, the funding of schools, the curriculum in schools, the access to various interventions and supports for students, what we can take away when we have the opportunity to, because we think too many people are having access. And so many of us have been long committed to education justice. And now is this pivotal moment where the anti-CRT attacks have been used not only to attack the curriculum and to push back advances in public education that have been made by our advocates who have long been doing this work, but it's also a time to actually attack democracy, right? It's a local level fight. And so that's the context that we're in now. It seems even more important to figure out how to invest in long-term solutions, invest in the communities and the folks on the ground in real and sustained ways. And so that's how we're gonna center our conversation now about the opportunity of endowments and learn a little bit more about what Schott Foundation is trying to do in its work and what that promise may be for others of our colleagues in philanthropy to do something transformational and continue to invest in the long-term sustainability of the work we all know to be super important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to give a bit of a greater context for our discussion today.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning.
Good morning.
So we are having a family discussion here, and I won't do like Coben Young and cuss anybody out, but it is a discussion, and it's not personal, but it is personal, because we in philanthropy, we do a lot of good and we do a lot of harm. And often the case is, in order to become better, we've got to be very reflective on the ways that we may cause some harm and the things that we can do better. So I'm not talking about anyone, I'm just saying what I'm saying. I want to start off first. The Schott Foundation is a public fund. We serve as an intermediary between philanthropy and grassroots advocacy organizations. And what we mean by that is philanthropy has happened for a number of years, decades, but often the case is the dollars don't flow the same way to BPOC-led organizations. This we know. There are a host of practices and policies and processes that we have in place that somehow serve as a barrier to these organizations getting the resources. So for the past 30 years, the foundation has tried to bridge that gap between philanthropy and grassroots youth-led and parent-led organizations. So we are celebrating our 30th year anniversary this year. And as a part of doing this work, we as a foundation also have to be reflective on how we can become better in doing this work. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is a strategy that over the past 18 months in consultation with our board of directors, we sort of put forward. And I'll tell you a little more about it as we get into it. The first part of it, I want you to imagine that you were presented with a job opportunity, running an organization, maybe even a foundation. And as a part of that, what they told you was, you are going to run this foundation, but we are only going to give you dollars when there's a crisis. All right? You only get crisis funding. And then they say, well, you know, there may be some occasions where we will also provide you just enough resources to write the checks, what we would call checkbook philanthropy. We're familiar with that in philanthropy, right? But you often don't see an organization doing checkbook philanthropy because there's no resources there for staff capacity to process the checks or what have you. But then we also said, well, it might be a good idea to provide beyond just checkbook philanthropy and crisis resources, some resources to build the staff capacity. Do you like the job a little better now? Now you have staff to do the job, right? You have the opportunity to do good by writing checks, and you have crisis funding. But the final part of that is you might want to ask for, and you might want to understand how often you're going to receive those resources. Some sustainable funding resource. This isn't anything in this scenario that is foreign to the philanthropic sector, because in the philanthropic sector, crisis funding, we call it rapid response funding. Checkbook philanthropy, in many respects, we call it programmatic support. Unrestricted, we call it capacity building. This has been the evolution of philanthropy. We started, in many respects, we recognized that we had to go beyond rapid response funding because we needed to maintain the capacity of the organizations. We recognized that they needed more programmatic support. Over the last 2 years of what we've seen, many of the philanthropic partners have talked about providing unrestricted resources and capacity building. And yet, in the evolution of philanthropy, there's a piece that we've left out: sustainable funding, endowing organizations. And this isn't anything that should be foreign to us, because the majority of institutional foundations are funded through endowments. That's our power source. That's how we maintain, that's how we plan, and yet there are organizations that we work with, that we care about, that we haven't strategically taken the step to provide sustainable funding. We know that within racial equity and justice organizations are underfunded. This is a study that we did with Candid, and Candid collects data on philanthropic giving. And from 2017 to 2019, there was over $1.4 billion provided in philanthropic funding. Yet only 10% of that was provided racial equity funding. 10%, 109. And of that, only less than 1% was provided in racial justice funding. Well, you know, the difference there is when you look at racial equity, often the case when you talk about racial equity, it's to provide the supports, the tools. And when we talk about racial justice, it's to provide the ecosystem. I'll give you an example. You can have, in the voting context, you can have an equal number of voting polls, an equal number of precinct workers. But if the ecosystem in which individuals are voting in is oppressive, then you don't have a just voting system. You won't get an equitable and just outcome. So we need racial equity and racial justice, of which both are underfunded in this space. But also, as we talk about sustainable funding, we look at endowments. From 2000 to 2013, only 5% of gifts of $10 million or more to social change causes took the form of an endowment. Endowments for organizations led by people of color are nearly 4 times smaller than those led by white-led organizations, and their average revenue is less than half. So again, as we look at the evolution of funding, the evolution of philanthropy, somehow this is a component that we have yet to integrate into supporting these organizations. And it's not because of the organizations. One might say, well, we don't know if these organizations can handle this money. We don't know what they can do. Because if you look at many of these youth-led and parent-led organizations, they're already doing more with less. They're doing the critical work. They're showing up at the school board meetings. They are organizing at our state capitals. They're registering voters. They're doing more than less. The return on investment that we've seen is clear. So it's not a matter of impact. You know, at the Schott Foundation, there was, and Dakia will tell you more about this, an organization that Schott funded for the past 20 years plus. And we probably provided $20 million over that 20-year period. I won't ask you to think about your portfolios and how long you've funded one organization. But for 20 years, we funded AQE, the Alliance for Quality Education, $20 million. Last year, from that advocacy, they won $4 billion from the New York State Legislature. Now, who would take that return on investment? $20 million for a $4 billion public return. And it's about providing sustainable resources. They do more with less. They have the impact. You don't believe? Take an organization like the NAACP. And I'm glad Derek is joining us today. Organization where the impact has been clear. The 1964 Civil Rights Act doesn't happen without the NAACP. The Voting Rights Act, 100 years, doesn't have an endowment. Number of philanthropic supporters, it's not for a lack of desire, but we haven't taken that next step. So they do more with less, the impact is clear, and yet we haven't. Part of the reason and part of the conversation today is one of the main pieces that we underestimate in our philanthropic process is trust. Trust is a commodity. And too often we've sort of built these transactional relationships with grantee partners and even within our institutions. But it has to start with trust-based philanthropy. Trusting that they have the knowledge and context that's necessary. Trusting that they have the tactics that are necessary to bring about systemic change. And trusting that they know how to use the resources better than we do. And often the case, we're holding on to the resources. It's really built off of some type of ideology that says, we know how to use these resources to help you better than, so we're gonna hold on to them. So it starts with trust-based philanthropy. Then we understand that there has to be a strategic effort to build the capacity of the organizations. Yes, they've done more with less, but they could do more with more. And when we look across society, more is necessary right now. More is necessary. So why wouldn't we take the next step and build sustainable funding sources, sustainable planning for these organizations? And I say this because those that we're pushing against, those that are fighting for the inequities, and there are those who are fighting for inequities right now, that don't want it, they're in it for the long haul. Fortunate enough, these organizations, our grantee partners, have been in it for the long haul. So the fight is going to be for the long haul. They're in it for the long haul. Their resources should be in it for the long haul. So I said 18 months ago at the Schott Foundation, went to the board and I asked the board, could we perhaps raise $30 million? That's more money than we have in our own assets. Could we raise $30 million and give that $30 million to 3 organizations so that they would have endowments larger than our endowment? $10 million each. And that's what we've set out to do. When we launched the Racial Justice and Education Endowment, it's a $30 million fund in which we will provide 3 National Education Alliance organizations, Education National Alliance organizations, $10 million endowments. During the 5-year period, they will be a part of the investment committee. They will receive the technical support, training, and we will gain from their insight on how to invest these dollars. Why $30 million? Because $30 million at the end of the 5-year period at a 5% drawdown will produce $1.5 million in unrestricted resources for their budgets each year. And as those dollars increase, that annual drawdown amount increases. We know this. We work in that space. So this is an effort that we're putting forward. And we're happy to be working with Lee Parker at J.P. Morgan to structure the type of support, technical assistance, and to leverage the type of impact that's worthy of the work that these leaders across the country, passionate people, and organizations that have proven impact and done more with less, has proven they should have these resources. We didn't do it yesterday. If we try to do it tomorrow, it's too late. That's why we say we have to endow now. But it's going to take more than just this effort. It's going to take philanthropy as a whole leaning in and completing this evolution of how we support these organizations. So I'll pause there, take my seat, and then we'll have a more fruitful discussion as we hear from our other partners. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You did a great job of laying out the case for endowments and sort of charting out what our organization has been doing and why. You know, we've made a bit of a call that says, join us in this effort. If you are, as a president, as you're thinking about this, what are the things that you would share with folks about what they should be thinking about if they were going to consider an endowment such as this?
Well, first, looking at the policies of your organization. There are some foundations that have written in policy that they don't support endowment. And as we begin to talk about what are some of the structural barriers to equity that exist within our sector, we know the benefit of endowments. So why would such a policy exist within our organizations? I would say there's also a learning process, a learning agenda that has to come. Because I mentioned I had to go to a board. And I had to go to a board with a request that would be very extreme in a lot of boardrooms. But it was a board that was ready over years. We had sort of cultivated its space.